This is one of the key recommendations of Buenos Aires Plan of Action that we adopted in Buenos Aires a couple of weeks back. And this is absolutely essential as we move forward in terms of our engagement with South-South cooperation. So this, I think, is extremely important. Governments are waiting for our recommendation. There is a growing traction, as we heard Secretary Economic Relations yesterday. Government of India is very keen not only to see what direction we are going in, but they are also very interested in the South-South cooperation projects which are being delivered in different countries by the South-South partnership mechanism. Three issues they are confronting. One, as we heard the minister, that they should be delivered when they are needed most. So usually not so much in case of China, but definitely in case of India, we see delays in the project implementation and how we can deliver them well in time when they are required. Second important issue is when this is delivered, what kind of impact it is leaving behind. In the session that we had last evening, we heard about not only ex ante and ex post analysis, but also during the project's implementation phase, if we can have the assessment possible. And this makes the task of the academics who are working on impact assessment all the more challenging. The third point is about the very idea of abiding by the principles. And as we have been taking a position in NEST, the impact assessment for South-South cooperation should be done at two levels. One, it has to be sensitive to the principles of South-South cooperation. We heard enough about the principles of South-South cooperation, and I'm sure my panel would also be capturing those principles, so I'm not getting into that. But definitely it is important for us to see what principles, what modalities, what kind of indicators to capture whether principles are being followed, and what indicators for capturing details of modalities. So this kind of four-point matrix is extremely important when we are going for impact assessment of South-South cooperation. So when we are doing that, it is important that countries, though it is very difficult, as we heard yesterday, to abide by those principles, because principles are, after all, a statement of intent, and that is difficult when you go on the ground. So to keep you on the track and to keep you on the track to follow those principles and do the course correction when projects are moving forward is absolutely full with challenges. And that's where role of academics and role of institutions like NEST that comes forward. In context of India, we are trying to do that through the Forum for Indian Development Cooperation, FIDC, and I requested my colleague Kostov to join this panel, who is very actively working on issues that are related to India's development cooperation as a civil society member, and that is absolutely fascinating, because then you bring in the heft of the various institutional perspectives when assessments are to be done. We also heard yesterday that India's Prime Minister announced in Uganda a 10-point principal agenda for India's engagement with Africa. We have captured that. We have published the details in the Development Cooperation Review in our publication, and there are many more commentaries already written on India's this 10 principal agenda with Africa, and that I think is important. Last point that I want to mention here is the need to visit the development perspective afresh. And I'm very glad my dear friend, though very often just to pull him, we say that he's on the other side of the stream. But I think at times, if ideas are converging, there is no point in not doing the handshake that is required. And I'm really looking at Mario Pezzani here, who very rightly pointed out yesterday to revisit the development model. The Anglo-Saxon development model requires to be revisited. The prescriptive approaches of the development model and the theorization done by the Western scholars, that requires to be revisited, not just because the damage it has done in South America and many other places through the structural adjustment program, but because of the absence of endogeneity in the process. And that endogeneity, local resources, local sort of leveraging of technology and due space for local employment, that gives the heft that is required for development model. It is also very important when we see that these development projects do not deliver to the local expectations, a disconnect appears. And we have seen this in case of ODA. So how we go forward is something that South requires. And I'm glad that this panel is trying to capture that question of local connect of development cooperation, providing that necessary policy space which is needed for discussing the scope for we to move forward, and not just saying in principles that this is based on local demand. So local demand is not an induced demand. Local demand is delivering to the local requirements and answering to the local aspirations and hopes. That's where the democratization of the development cooperation architecture comes in, and that's where we need to see that South-South cooperation remains on that track. It follows that track which is required. My friend reflected that yesterday evening in the session on triangular cooperation when we heard the experience of Afghanistan, and Dr. Kabiri did point out this perspective of localization. At RIS, two of my senior colleagues, Dr. P.K. Anand and Mr. Krishna Kumar, are following this question from the perspective of sustainable development goals. And localization of SDGs reflect the very ambition we have in terms of bringing in development cooperation, dovetailing the development agenda as all of us are committed for SDGs. So that way you have the right ecosystem which requires to be nurtured and not regimentized, but definitely some sort of guiding principles and touchstones that were listed yesterday, I think are absolutely important. In our background note and also in agenda this time, you might have seen a new column that we have added with questions, and those questions are there for my panel as well in terms of how we are going to go forward on assessment process. The background note raises some 6 or 7 questions. The title of the conference is South-South and Triangular Cooperation. And yesterday evening, those who were in the session on triangular cooperation would very much recall the discussion that we had about the idea of triangular cooperation not equivalent to South-South cooperation. And Professor Gladys did mention this point very forcefully, that SSC plus TRC is not equivalent to development cooperation. So those distinctions, those uniqueness are there, but they should not be dividing or pushing apart the possibility of we working together. And that's where the convergence possibilities, and that's where the BAPA plus 40 declaration comes out very clearly, very forcefully, that we have to work together. And that, I think, is absolutely essential for us to see how we follow the same track. Assessment is also becoming important, and that's my last point. Assessment is also very important because quantums have multiplied. South-South cooperation now is flowing with quantums which are unprecedented in the history of Second World War, post-Second World War time period that we have seen. Never before we have seen such quantums being pushed in. Now, as quantums multiply, the ability to ensure adherence to principles become all the more challenging. And when it becomes challenging, you are likely to navigate in some other direction if guiding principles and modality related indicators are not constantly telling you. I mean, they are just like your GPS. They should be telling you what direction you are really going in, and it has to be on real time basis. And that's where role of multi-stakeholder participation comes in. That's where the role of multiple institutional approaches come in, and role of indicators and assessment frameworks are important. Time has come when South cannot avoid this adherence to these principles and modalities. They have to have their framework. And with that,